Ivy had a business trip coming up and she seemed unusually excited about it. We'd been married for 7 years, and while our relationship had settled into a comfortable routine, I never had any reason to doubt her. She was dedicated to her career, and I knew how much she enjoyed these trips. This time she was headed to Miami, a place she'd been to before for work, but something was different this time. She spent more time than usual picking out her outfits, planning everything down to the last detail. It wasn't just the work she was enthusiastic about. She talked about how she might extend her stay by a couple of days, explore the city, maybe hit the beach. I didn't think much of it. Ivy had always been spontaneous, and I figured a few extra days in Miami would do her good. "You deserve a break," I told her, trying to be the supportive husband. "Just don't forget to bring me back something nice." The night before she left, we had dinner at home. She was animated, talking about the meetings she was going to have, the presentation she was giving, and all the bigwigs she'd be meeting. I was proud of her, like always. She'd come a long way in her career, and I loved seeing her so passionate about her work. We shared a bottle of wine, talked about the future, and eventually went to bed. I remember waking up early the next morning to the sound of her moving around the house, getting ready. She kissed me goodbye as I lay in bed, half asleep. "I'll miss you," she said. "So will I mumbled. And that was that. I heard the door close behind her, and then I drifted back to sleep. The first few days were normal. We texted back and forth, sharing the usual updates about our days. She sent me pictures of the beach, the hotel she was staying at, and even a few of the fancy meals she was having. But then, the texts started to taper off. At first I didn't think much of it. She was probably just busy with work. But as the days went by, I noticed that she was taking longer to reply, and when she did, her messages were shorter, less detailed. By the time she was supposed to be coming back, I was starting to feel uneasy. I chalked it up to being paranoid. I mean, we'd been together for so long, and Ivy wasn't the type to do anything to jeopardize that. But still, something felt off. When she finally came home 2 days later than originally planned, she seemed different. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things. She was a bit more distant, not as chatty as she usually was after a trip. She didn't talk much about Miami, only giving vague answers when I asked how it went. One night, a few days after she'd returned, I noticed she was texting someone late at night. Ivy never hid her phone from me, so it wasn't like she was being secretive, but she seemed unusually guarded about this conversation. When I casually asked who it was, she quickly said it was a colleague, something about a follow-up from the trip. I didn't press her on it, but the doubt had already planted itself in my mind. The next morning, I found myself staring at her phone, which she had left charging on the kitchen counter. The temptation was there, nagging at me, but I pushed it aside. I wasn't the kind of guy to snoop through my wife's phone. Besides, I trusted her, didn't I? Still, the thought lingered, gnawing at me. A few more days passed, and Ivy's behavior didn't improve. She was distracted, almost like she was there, but not really. The conversations felt forced, and she started spending more time out of the house. "Work stuff," she'd say, heading out in the evenings. She'd always had to work late sometimes, but this felt different, more frequent, less predictable. One evening I decided to follow her. I felt ridiculous, like some paranoid teenager. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She left the house around 8 p.m., dressed a bit nicer than usual for a supposed work meeting. I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. It was fall, and the days were getting shorter, so it was already dark outside. This played to my advantage. My car was a common make, with a nondescript color that wouldn't stand out, and I knew Ivy wouldn't recognize it unless she got a close look. I made sure to keep a good distance between us as I followed her, far enough that she wouldn't be able to see my license plate or even notice she was being tailed. I trailed her across town, past her office, and eventually to a restaurant on the other side of the city. I parked a few spots away where I could still see her car but wouldn't be visible if she glanced out the window. My heart was pounding and I could feel my hands shaking as I tried to decide what to do. After a few minutes, I got out of the car and walked toward the restaurant. I peered through the windows, scanning the room for her. It didn't take long to spot her in a corner booth, sitting across from a man I didn't recognize. They were deep in conversation, leaning in close. Ivy was smiling, a real genuine smile, the kind I hadn't seen from her in a while. The man reached across the table and took her hand, and that was when I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. I turned and walked back to my car, my mind racing. I didn't need to see any more. There it was, in plain sight. I sat in the car for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the dashboard, trying to process what I had just seen. This wasn't supposed to happen to me, to us. We were solid, or at least I thought we were. After that night at the restaurant, everything changed. I couldn't look at Ivy the same way, and every word she said seemed to carry a double meaning. But I knew I needed more than just a single glimpse through a restaurant window to confront her. That scene had burned itself into my mind, but it wasn't enough. I had to be certain. I had to know who that man was, what they were doing together, and if there was something more than just a dinner meeting. Ivy's behavior didn't improve after that night, which only fueled my suspicions. She continued to be distant, always distracted, like she was somewhere else even when she was right next to me. And the late-night texts didn't stop either. If anything, they became more frequent. I began to notice that she would take her phone with her everywhere she went, even to the bathroom, which was something she never used to do. It was as if she was deliberately keeping it out of my sight. One evening, a few days after I had followed her to the restaurant, I decided it was time to take action. Ivy had mentioned she'd be home late again, another work thing. I pretended not to care, just nodded and went about my business. But the moment she walked out the door, I sprang into action. I had already done some research, and I knew exactly what I was looking for. I logged into our shared phone account online and started pulling up her recent call and text logs. I wasn't exactly proud of myself for snooping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was necessary. As I scrolled through the list of numbers, I recognized most of them. Friends, family, colleagues. But there was one number that kept popping up more than the others, especially late at night and during those work meetings. The number wasn't saved in her contacts, which struck me as odd. I copied it down and did a quick search online. It didn't take long to find out that it was a burner phone, untraceable, at least in any conventional sense. My stomach turned. There was no good reason for Ivy to be using a burner phone unless she was hiding something, probably serious. I didn't know what to do next. Part of me wanted to call the number just to hear who picked up on the other end. But I knew that would be a mistake. If she found out I was onto her, she would just become more secretive. I needed to play it cool, keep gathering evidence until I had something undeniable. The next few days were challenging. Ivy carried on with her usual routine, but I was hyper-aware of everything she did. Every time her phone buzzed, every time she stepped out of the room to take a call, my mind went straight to that night at the restaurant. I tried to keep things normal between us, but it was exhausting pretending that everything was okay when I knew it wasn't. One day, I decided to dig deeper into her digital footprint. Ivy was careful, but nobody is perfect. I remembered she used a laptop for work and sometimes at home. When she wasn't around, I decided to take a look. She had left it on the kitchen table, and luckily she wasn't in the habit of logging out or locking it. It was a risk, but I couldn't resist. I opened it up, and there it was. Her email, still logged in. I scanned through her inbox looking for anything unusual. Most of it was work-related, but there were a few emails that caught my eye. They were from a personal email account, one I didn't recognize, and they were short, cryptic. It was mostly small talk, mentions of meeting up, or just one-word responses like yes or okay. Then I found something. An email with an attachment, sent just before her trip to Miami. The subject line was simple: looking forward to this. The email itself was blank, but the attachment was a hotel reservation. Not for the place Ivy had told me she was staying, but for a different, much more expensive hotel on the beach. The reservation was for 2 people. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the screen. This was more than just a friendly dinner. She planned this and lied to me. My mind flashed back to that night at the restaurant, and everything started to make sense. I quickly copied the reservation details onto my phone, along with the emails and the burner phone number. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with this information yet, but I knew I needed to have it. The more I thought it over, the less I felt like I knew the woman I had married. Ivy came home late, like she had said she would. But she didn't seem tired. In fact, she looked almost energized, like she had just had a great time. She slid into bed beside me, whispered a quick goodnight, and was asleep within minutes. I lay there, staring at the ceiling. I spent the next few days preparing. I started being more observant, paying attention to Ivy's habits, her schedule, everything. I noticed she was being more careful with her phone, even deleting messages after reading them. But that only made me more determined. I knew that sooner or later she would slip up, and I had to be ready when she did. Then one evening, the opportunity presented itself. Ivy had just come home from work, and she seemed distracted. She mentioned something about having to go back out later for an important meeting. I played along, acting like I didn't suspect a thing. "Do you need me to pick up anything for dinner?" I asked casually. She shook her head, said she wouldn't be gone long. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and headed out, making sure to give her a few minutes head start. This time I was more prepared. I had my phone ready to record, and I knew exactly where she was going. She had made a mistake earlier that day, leaving her planner open on the counter. I saw the name of the restaurant and the time of the meeting scrawled on one of the pages. I followed her again, keeping my distance like before, careful not to let her notice me. The dark fall evening worked in my favor. My car blended into the sea of other vehicles on the road, and I knew she wouldn't recognize it in the dark. I kept far enough behind that she couldn't see my license plate, and I made sure to stay calm, even as my heart pounded in my chest. She pulled into the parking lot of the same restaurant as before, and I parked a few spaces away, just like last time. I watched as she got out of the car and walked inside, her phone clutched in her hand. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone, got out of the car, and walked toward the entrance. I paused for a moment just outside the window, taking a deep breath before peering inside. There she was, sitting at the same booth across from the same man. They were laughing, talking, completely absorbed in each other. I took a few steps closer, enough to see them more clearly, but still far enough to stay unnoticed. I watched as she leaned in, the man's hand sliding across the table to rest on hers. Ivy's smile was wide, genuine, the kind of smile she hadn't given me in months. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, a mix of anger and despair swirling inside me. But I stayed focused. I needed to capture this, to have something concrete. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures, making sure to get both of them in the frame. Then I hit record, capturing a short video of them together. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to confront her, to force her to tell me the truth. I turned and walked back to my car, my mind numb. There was no denying it now. I had no idea how to proceed at first. My mother-in-law, Patricia, came to mind later. We got along well. She has always been in favor of family values and would not tolerate cheating in her family. One of our first meetings together, she told me at length what good values she had instilled in her daughter and that she would be a wonderful wife. I knew her character and nature. I trusted her, and I could ask her not to tell Ivy how she found out about her affair. I decided to go to Patricia's house the next morning. I didn't tell her much over the phone, just that I needed to talk to her about something serious. She agreed, sounding concerned, and told me to come over right away. I brought everything with me, the pictures, the video, and the emails. I wasn't sure how she would react, but I trusted her judgment. When I arrived, Patricia welcomed me in, her eyes full of worry. We sat down in the living room, and I got straight to the point. I told her everything I had discovered. The night I followed Ivy, the burner phone, the emails, and the man at the restaurant. As I spoke, I could see Patricia's expression shift from concern to shock, and finally to anger. She listened quietly, absorbing every detail. When I finished, I showed her the pictures and the video I had taken. Patricia's face went pale as she watched, her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The realization of what Ivy had done hit her hard. Patricia didn't say much at first, just shook her head in disbelief. She couldn't understand how Ivy, her daughter, could have done something like this. I could see the disappointment and fury building in her eyes. She told me she was outraged and hurt, and that she never expected Ivy to betray me like this. I explained to Patricia that I wasn't sure how to confront Ivy, and that I needed her help. I trusted Patricia to guide me through this. but I also asked her to keep our conversation a secret from Ivy. I wanted to confront Ivy on my own terms, without her knowing that I had already confided in her mother. Patricia agreed to help, but she was adamant that Ivy needed to be held accountable. She told me she would talk to Ivy herself, to make sure she understood the gravity of what she had done. Patricia assured me that she would be firm with Ivy, making it clear that this kind of behavior was unacceptable and could destroy our marriage. However, she promised not to mention that I had come to her first. She would handle the situation carefully, making sure Ivy knew how serious this was without revealing how she found out. I left Patricia's house feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. I trusted her to confront Ivy, but I knew this wasn't over. I waited anxiously for the fallout, wondering how Ivy would react to her mother's confrontation. The next day, Patricia called Ivy over to her house under the pretense of needing help with something. Ivy didn't suspect anything, and I knew she wouldn't see it coming. Patricia later told me how it went down. She had started by reminding Ivy of the values she was raised with, the importance of family, loyalty, and trust. Then she confronted Ivy directly, asking her if there was anything she wanted to confess. Ivy had denied everything at first, but Patricia wasn't having any of it. She told Ivy that she knew what was going on and made it clear that this behavior was unacceptable. Patricia explained to Ivy like she was a child, reminding her of the values she had been taught, and how this affair was a complete betrayal of those principles. She told Ivy that she needed to end it immediately and warned her that if I ever found out, it could destroy our marriage. Patricia said that Ivy eventually broke down and admitted that she had made a terrible mistake. She didn't go into much detail, but she promised her mother that the affair was over and that she would end it for good. Patricia made Ivy swear that she would fix this and come clean to me before I found out from anyone else. After Ivy left her mother's house, Patricia called to update me. She told me that Ivy was shaken and had promised to end the affair. But Patricia also warned me to be careful. Just because Ivy was scared didn't mean she wouldn't try to cover it up. I needed to be ready for whatever came next. That evening, when Ivy came home, I could tell something had changed. She looked tired, almost defeated. But she didn't say anything about the conversation with her mother. She just went about her evening as if nothing had happened. Watching her, I realized that this wasn't going to be as simple as I had hoped. Ivy might have promised her mother that she would end the affair, but until she confessed to me, I couldn't trust that it was really over. Ivy's behavior continued to be guarded over the next few days. She seemed quieter than usual, more distant, but also strangely calm. It was as if she was walking on eggshells around me, trying to avoid any confrontation. I knew she was hiding something, but she hadn't said a word about her conversation with Patricia. I waited, giving her the space to come clean, but each day that passed made it clear she wasn't going to. Then one evening, while we were sitting in the living room watching TV, she turned to me and asked, "Have you talked to my mom lately?" Her tone was casual, almost too casual, like she was testing the waters. I kept my face neutral, pretending to be more interested in the show we were watching. "No, not since that birthday party we all went to a few weeks ago," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Why do you ask?" Ivy shrugged, her eyes flicking away from mine. "Just wondering. She mentioned she hadn't heard from you in a while." It was a lie. I knew it, and she knew it. "Yeah, I've been busy with work," I said, keeping my tone light. "I'll give her a call sometime soon." She nodded, and the conversation ended there. But I could feel the tension in the room, like a rope stretched too tight, ready to snap. Ivy was trying to gauge whether Patricia had spoken to me, whether I knew anything. The next morning I woke up early, my mind racing with thoughts of how to confront Ivy. I had given her plenty of time to come clean, but it was clear she wasn't going to. Patricia's confrontation hadn't been enough to push her to honesty, and I couldn't wait any longer. The longer this dragged on, the more it ate away at me. I decided that I would confront Ivy that night. I went through my day at work in a daze, barely able to focus. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be a message from Ivy, confessing everything. But each time it was just something mundane. A reminder about a meeting, a notification from one of those apps I never used. When I finally got home that evening, Ivy was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She looked up and gave me a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was a tension in her posture, a wariness that hadn't been there before. She was still on edge, still hiding behind her mask of normalcy. "Hey," I said, trying to sound as casual as possible. "How was your day?" "Fine," she replied, her eyes flicking back to the screen. "Busy, but nothing I couldn't handle." I nodded, dropping my keys on the counter. "Same here, just glad to be home." She didn't respond, just kept typing away on her laptop. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we weren't saying. "Are you hungry?" she asked after a few moments, finally closing the laptop and looking up at me. I was thinking about ordering in. "Sure," I said, "whatever you feel like." We decided on Chinese, one of our go-to comfort foods. The delivery arrived quickly and we sat down to eat in the dining room. Normally, we would chat about our day, make plans for the weekend, but tonight the conversation was stilted, forced. Ivy seemed distracted, picking at her food more than eating it. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I put down my fork and looked at her directly. "Ivy," I said, my voice more serious than I intended, "is there something you need to tell me?" She froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. For a moment she just stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Then she set down her fork and took a deep breath. "What do you mean?" "You've been different lately," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Distant. I feel like there's something going on, something you're not telling me." She looked down at her plate, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice was shaky, unconvincing. "Ivy, come on," I pressed, leaning forward slightly. "I'm not blind. I know something's been bothering you. If there's anything you need to say, now's the time to do it." She bit her lip, still not meeting my eyes. For a moment I thought she might actually come clean, that she might finally admit to everything. But then she shook her head, forcing a weak smile. "It's just work stress, George. I'm sorry if I've been distant, but there's nothing going on, I promise. And I also promise to become the person you wanted me to be and have seen me before." I stared at her, searching her face for any sign of truth, but all I saw was the same mask she'd been wearing for days. "Okay," I said slowly, leaning back in my chair. "If you say so." She nodded, visibly relieved that I was letting it go, at least for now. We finished the meal in silence, and the tension between us seemed to grow with every passing minute. After dinner, Ivy said she had some work to catch up on, and she retreated to the bedroom with her laptop, leaving me alone in the dining room with my thoughts. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty plates, feeling the anger and frustration bubbling up inside me. Later that night, as we got ready for bed, Ivy seemed to be on edge again. She avoided eye contact, barely said a word. I could feel the distance between us, a chasm that had been growing wider every day. When we finally crawled into bed, she turned away from me, pulling the covers up tight around her. The next morning I woke up early, determined to finally face the situation head on. Ivy was still asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady. For a moment I just watched her, feeling a pang of sadness for what we were about to go through. I got up quietly, not wanting to wake her, and headed to the kitchen to make some coffee. As I waited for the pot to brew, I thought about how I would approach her, how I would force her to finally tell the truth. When Ivy finally emerged from the bedroom, she looked surprised to see me up so early. "You're up already?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "It's Saturday." "Yeah, couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Made some coffee if you want some." "Thanks," she said, grabbing a mug and pouring herself a cup. She seemed to relax a little as she took a sip, leaning against the counter. But I could still see the unease in her eyes, the way she avoided looking directly at me. That evening, after Ivy returned from her walk, I decided it was time to confront her. I couldn't keep the truth hidden any longer, and I needed to hear her side of the story. As we sat down at the kitchen table, I looked at her seriously, knowing that this conversation would change everything. "Ivy," I began, keeping my tone steady, "I had a call from your mom earlier today." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, a flash of concern crossing her face. "What did she say?" "She told me something pretty shocking," I continued, watching her closely. She said she knows that you cheated on me. She mentioned someone you met during your business trip to Miami." Ivy's face went pale, and I could see the panic in her eyes. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, her mouth slightly open as if searching for the right words. "I don't know why Patricia would make up something like that," I said, leaning forward. "I can't imagine what reasons she would have to tell me something so serious if it wasn't true. So please, Ivy, explain to me what's really going on." Ivy's shoulders slumped as she let out a shaky breath. I could see the resignation in her expression as she realized there was no point in lying anymore. "George," she began softly, her voice trembling, "she's right, I did a terrible thing. I cheated on you." Even though I'd been expecting this, hearing her say the words out loud hit me like a ton of bricks. But strangely, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I had known the truth for a while, and now that it was finally out in the open, there was a strange kind of relief. I listened quietly as Ivy continued, laying everything bare. She explained how it had started, how she had met the man during a work event in Miami. It began innocently enough, but one thing led to another, and before she knew it, she was involved in an affair. She admitted that she had been scared, that she didn't know how to stop it without causing a scandal at work, and that she had felt trapped in her own lies. "I never meant for it to happen, George," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want to hurt you. I was just lost. But it's over now. I ended it. I know I've ruined everything, but I need you to know that it meant nothing to me. You mean everything to me." I looked at her calmly, my emotions surprisingly under control. "Ivy, I've known for a while," I admitted. "I saw you with him at the restaurant. I've known, but I needed to hear it from you." She blinked, stunned by my confession. "You knew? And you didn't say anything?" "I was waiting for the right moment," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "I wanted to see if you would come clean on your own. And now that you have, I'm relieved. But I have to be honest with you, Ivy. I don't know what to do next. I didn't think that far ahead." Ivy's lip quivered as she wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Can I have a second chance? I know I don't deserve it, but I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Please, George, just give me a chance to prove that I can change." I took a deep breath, considering her request. "I'll be watching, Ivy," I said evenly. "I need to see how much you're willing to change after this conversation. Your actions will speak louder than any promises you make. I can't make any decisions right now, but I'll be paying close attention to what you do from here on out." She nodded, clearly desperate for any glimmer of hope. "Thank you, George. I won't let you down." After we finished the conversation, Ivy retreated to the bedroom, emotionally drained. I stayed in the kitchen, letting everything sink in. I had finally heard the truth from her, and for the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe again. But as I sat there, I realized something else. I hadn't really thought about what would happen after this. I'd been so focused on getting the truth that I hadn't planned for what came next. Ivy had asked for a second chance, and I had agreed to give her one, but only under certain conditions. I would watch her, see if she really changed. But as I sat there, a new thought crept into my mind. Ivy had her own successful business, her own circle of friends and colleagues who were more successful, more polished than I was. She moved in different circles, and I couldn't help but wonder if deep down she had already lost interest in me. The thought didn't hurt as much as I expected it to. Instead, it felt like a realization that had been slowly building in the back of my mind. Ivy was ambitious, driven, and successful, and I wasn't at her level. Maybe that had something to do with why she strayed in the first place. Or maybe it was just a sign that we were growing apart. But strangely, I wasn't upset by this realization. If anything, it gave me a sense of clarity. I would continue to watch her, as I had said, but I would also take a step back and evaluate our relationship from a distance. For the first 2 or 3 weeks after our conversation, Ivy seemed like her old self again. From the outside, anyone would have thought that nothing had happened. She stopped staying late at work, sometimes even coming home before it got dark. We started spending more time together, doing things we used to enjoy, like going out of town on weekends. We'd take long drives, have picnics, and for a while, it felt like we were reconnecting. I was cautiously optimistic. Maybe she really had changed. Maybe she was committed to making things right between us. But I kept my guard up. Then one evening, everything shifted again. Ivy was late getting home, and she hadn't mentioned that she'd be working late. When she finally walked through the door, it was around the same time she used to come home when she was seeing that guy. Her eyes were red and puffy, and tears streaked down her face. "What happened?" I asked, concern lacing my voice as I got up from the couch to meet her. She wiped at her tears, sniffling. I finally broke it off with him, completely. I felt a strange mix of emotions swirl inside me. Relief, confusion, suspicion. "I thought you already did that." "I did," she said, nodding. "But he kept trying to contact me. I stopped answering his messages, but he started waiting for me near work. I ignored him, even told him to leave me alone. But today, I accidentally ran into him." Ivy took a shaky breath, her tears falling faster now. "He told me he was tired of it all, that I've become boring and that he's done with me. He said he was leaving me, that he never wanted to see me again. I told him I didn't care, that I didn't want to see him either. But he yelled at me, George. He shouted at me right there on the street." "Why are you crying, Ivy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "If you're never going to see him again, why are you upset? Or are you crying because of him?" She shook her head quickly. No, it's not that. It's all been so overwhelming. The confrontation, the shouting. It was just a lot to handle, that's all. I wanted to believe her, but something didn't sit right with me. Still, I let it go. "Okay," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's over now. We can move on." She nodded, wiping away the last of her tears. "Yeah, it's over." After that evening, things seemed to return to normal once more. We fell back into our routine, and Ivy seemed determined to move forward. But despite the return to normalcy, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept my guard up, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then it did. One day, by pure chance, I had to take my car to the service station for a routine check. During the diagnostics, the mechanic told me there were some serious issues with the pedals, something that could take several hours to repair. I wasn't in a rush, so I told the mechanic I'd come back the next day to oversee the work and ensure everything went smoothly. I planned to stay nearby while they fixed it. That evening, I told Ivy about the repair, letting her know I'd be out most of the next day. She nodded, not seeming particularly interested, but that was fine. I didn't expect her to be. The next morning, I arrived at the service station as planned, prepared to wait a few hours for the repairs. But as it turned out, the problem wasn't as serious as the mechanic had originally thought. It only took them about 40 minutes to fix it. Surprised but pleased, I decided to head back home earlier than expected. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed how quiet the house was. Ivy should have been home, but the silence felt heavy, almost ominous. As I approached the front door, I suddenly heard something that made my blood run cold. Soft, rhythmic sounds, unmistakably coming from the bedroom. Women's moans. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved quietly toward the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. I pushed it open just enough to see inside, and what I saw made my stomach drop. There on our bed was the man Ivy had supposedly cut out of her life. He was lying on his back, a satisfied grin on his face, while Ivy straddled him, her knees bent as she rode him with an intensity that made my head spin. Without thinking, I burst into the room, rage consuming me. I had always considered myself a quiet, non-confrontational guy. I was thin, not particularly strong, and certainly not the type to start a fight. But in that moment, something primal took over. With a surge of adrenaline I didn't know I had, I grabbed the guy by the arm and yanked him off the bed. The next thing I knew, I was dragging him through the house and out the front door, shoving him onto the street. I barely noticed his protests, the shock on his face as he scrambled to his feet and ran off, half naked and humiliated. When I returned to the bedroom, Ivy was sitting on the bed, her face buried in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at her, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "George, I didn't want this. I didn't mean for this to happen." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Didn't want this? Didn't mean for this to happen. Ivy, I caught you in our bed with him. After everything we've been through, you still... Why, Ivy? Why? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. I thought it was over, but when he showed up again, I couldn't help myself. I was so angry when he said he didn't want to see me anymore, but when he came back, I just couldn't resist. We usually went to his place, but his nephews were visiting, so we came here. I thought you'd be at the repair shop all day. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. So you're telling me that after everything, after promising it was over, you just jumped back into bed with him because he showed up? You betrayed me in our own home, on our own bed. She broke down completely, her body shaking with sobs. I'm sorry, George, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with me. I didn't think. I just acted. Please, you have to believe me, it's over, it really is. I'll never see him again. But her words meant nothing to me. The shock of the situation had worn off, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. You know what, Ivy? I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. Unlike him, I truly never want to see you again. Take whatever you want from the house. I don't need anything from you. File for divorce yourself and do it quickly. The only time I want to hear from you is when you have something to say about the divorce. Other than that, don't bother me. She stared at me, her eyes wide with desperation. George, no, please don't leave me. I'll change, I promise. Just give me one more chance. But I had already made up my mind. Without another word, I walked out of the bedroom, grabbing a suitcase from the closet. I started packing my things, throwing clothes and essentials into the bag with little care. Ivy followed me, pleading, trying to grab at my arm, but I shook her off. I was done. With my bag packed, I headed for the door, ignoring Ivy's sobs and desperate apologies. I threw my things into the car and drove off without looking back. My mind was made up, and there was no turning back. I drove to my father's house, a small place about 100 miles out of the city. He lived alone, far from everything, and I knew it would be the perfect place to clear my head. For too long I had been living in limbo, trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. Ivy's betrayal had cut deep, but it also freed me. When I finally arrived at my father's house, he welcomed me without question, sensing that I needed space. I settled into the guest room, unpacking my things slowly, methodically. The quiet of the house was a stark contrast to the chaos I had just left behind, but it was exactly what I needed. My dad looked up when I walked in, instantly sensing that something was wrong. I sat down at the table, and after a moment of silence, I told him everything. How I had caught Ivy in bed with that man, how I had thrown him out, and how I had left her behind to come here. My father listened quietly, not interrupting, not asking questions. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said, "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need, George. We'll get through this together." He didn't comment on Ivy's behavior, didn't offer any advice or judgment. He simply made it clear that I had a place there, that he would support me no matter what, and that was enough. We spent the evening in companionable silence, working through the anger and the hurt in our own ways. Over the next few days, I started helping my father around the ranch. He was getting older, and the work was becoming too much for him to handle on his own. With me there, we were able to expand what we were doing, take on more tasks that he had been struggling to keep up with. We prepared for the winter together, stocking up supplies, repairing fences, and making sure everything was in order. The work was hard, but it was exactly what I needed. Winter came and went, and we survived it with ease. During that time, I heard nothing from Ivy. Not a word, not a text, nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished from my life, and I found that I didn't miss her. In fact, I barely thought about her at all. Life on the ranch had become my new normal, and I was content with that. But then, in March, my phone rang. It was Patricia, Ivy's mother. I hadn't heard from her since I left, so her call came as a surprise. When I answered, Patricia got straight to the point. She told me that she knew everything that had happened after I left. A few days after I'd gone to the ranch, she had reached out to Ivy, and through her persistent nature, she had managed to get the whole truth out of her daughter. Patricia explained that she had decided not to call me right away, wanting to give me time to process everything, to be able to look at the situation from a different angle. In those few months, Patricia said. She hoped I had found some clarity, just as she had. Then she dropped the bombshell. Ivy was still my wife. She hadn't filed for divorce, and despite my departure, she had quickly returned to her normal life. She continued running her business and, more disturbingly, had continued seeing that man, the very one I had caught her with. They hadn't stopped doing business together despite everything that had happened. I was stunned. "How do you know all this?" I asked, unable to hide my surprise. Patricia's voice was calm, almost resigned. "I know my daughter, George. I know how to get the truth out of her even when she doesn't want to tell it. But I didn't call today by chance. Karma finally caught up with her." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" Patricia explained that the man Ivy had been seeing had managed to get deep into her trust. He had used her both as a business partner and as a lover, and when he had gotten what he wanted, he dropped her. Not only did he end their relationship, but he also scammed her out of a significant amount of money, leaving her business in shambles. Word had spread quickly, and Ivy's reputation was now in tatters among her colleagues. She was actively looking for work, but her prospects were bleak. I listened quietly as Patricia laid it all out. When she finished, I knew what I had to do. The situation had become clearer, and there was no more doubt in my mind. I needed to file for divorce myself, to cut ties with Ivy once and for all. The house, the possessions. We could sort all that out later. The divorce process was quick and easy, mostly because I didn't object to anything Ivy asked for. I wanted it over as soon as possible, and within a matter of weeks the papers were signed and our marriage was officially dissolved. One day, after finalizing the divorce, I returned to the ranch from a trip into the city. I was settling back into the routine when, to my surprise, a taxi pulled up to the house. I watched as the door opened and Ivy stepped out, her face pale and drawn. She had suitcases with her, and it didn't take a genius to figure out what she was planning. She walked up to me, her eyes filled with desperation. Before I could say anything, she started talking, her words tumbling out in a rush. "George, I know I messed up. I know I was a fool and I've lost everything because of it. I'm so sorry for what I did. I know we're not married anymore, but please, I need you. I can't do this alone. Just let me stay here even if we're not together. I just need to be near you." I looked at her, keeping my expression unreadable. "You came all the way out here with your suitcases, so you thought I'd just accept you back just like that?" She stared at me, fear and hope mingling in her eyes. I was hoping." I let the silence stretch for a moment, watching her squirm. Then I finally spoke. "Of course I'll accept you, Ivy, but not as my wife, not as anything more than a worker." Her face crumpled in confusion. "What?" I pointed to the barn. "You can change into some work clothes and start by cleaning the manure from the cattle. From now on, all that kind of work is your responsibility. No more makeup, no more fancy clothes. You want to stay here? You earn your keep." Ivy looked at me, her expression a mix of disbelief and horror. But then, seeing that there was no other option, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll do it." She went inside, changed into some old clothes, and trudged out to the barn. As I watched her go, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Over the next few days, Ivy threw herself into the work. The fancy manicures and pedicures were gone, replaced by the hard labor of a ranch hand. My father didn't say much about the situation, but I could see the disapproval in his eyes whenever he looked at her. He too had no sympathy for Ivy's plight. One evening, after a long day of work, I found Ivy in the barn, finishing up her chores. She looked up as I approached, her face flushed from the physical labor. I could see the fatigue in her eyes, but also something else, a deep sadness, a resignation to her new reality. I decided it was time to ask the question that had been on my mind since the day she arrived with her suitcases. "Ivy," I began, my voice calm but firm, "why did you come here? Why did you decide to move back, knowing that things could never go back to the way they were?" She looked at me, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment she didn't answer, just stared at the ground as if searching for the right words. Finally she sighed and wiped a stray tear from her cheek. "I know why you're asking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think I came here hoping that you'd forgive me, that we could somehow be together again, but that's not it. I know you'll never forgive me, George. I see it in your eyes every day." I waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. She sniffled and continued, her voice cracking with emotion. "The truth is, I can't live on my own. I've realized how weak I've become. Over the years of running my business, I got used to having people do everything for me. I was so focused on my work, on success, that I let myself become helpless. When everything fell apart, when he left me, when my business crumbled, I realized I couldn't take care of myself. I didn't even have the money to hire a maid or a cook. I didn't have anyone to turn to except you." My answer was short. "I see. Well, make sure you clean out the barn and you can go sit down to dinner," I said with a smile and went inside.